look at, like you talk about the news, one of the things obviously everyone hears about in the news every night is tariffs. Can you give us a little bit of your perspective on what tariffs are going to do to the economy in the near and long term?
Felt like making a joke of, I don't know what you're talking about with tariffs, but I figured that the market mood probably isn't there for that. It has been, I'll say one of the strangest things for me about this process is that 4 months ago, we elected a president who was very clear that this was going to be his policy. He laid it out. And there was an initial reaction to the policy in certain segments of the market and generally a very positive view. And then he went and actually did what he campaigned on. And the level of market chaos, it's like, I don't know if people thought that he was joking. I'm still, just from a human standpoint, I'm trying to understand what the shift in the mood has been. What we know, I think what our take on tariffs are is that, number one, probably not anyone's favorite economic tool in the mainstream economy. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that it is it's a tax on importers. So when we say that it is, you're taxing international companies, that's not actually technically true. You're taxing domestic purchasers of international goods. And so what it can do is it can raise the prices of those goods to end clients of, things that are kind of bought or billed overseas. And I think a lot of the reaction that we've had is the U.S. is typically not engaged in a lot of tariff activity, even though a lot of countries do actually engage in a lot of tariffs against us. So it's in some ways there's a lot of I think there's a lot of, I would say, unintended escalation for people on the fear of us kind of retaliating with tariffs. But the reality is that other countries do use them in the U.S. Against the U.S. They use them against each other as kind of a way to protect the domestic industry. So, like if you want to have domestic steel, you would put a tariff on imported steel, and that would make the other countries' goods less competitive. In practice, what this does is this is what we'll call a regressive tax on consumers to the extent that it doesn't shift purchasing behavior or shift substitution. So if there's a good domestic counterpart, what it'll actually do is drive people to buy. So a great example would be wine. It would shift people to California instead of to Paris. And so then there's no major shift in prices. There's a shift in consumption, and that can be the desired outcome. If there isn't a good substitution, then the cost of things go up. So things like raw steel, things where there's just limited goods and the tax is going to be paid, that's going to push on prices. And typically on a lot of goods, what that means is that people with lower incomes experience it as a tax increase, which I think is where a lot of the anxiety on the policy comes from. Now, why we're probably not as concerned yet is that for a policy like this to stay in place for a long period of time, it has to have popular bipartisan support. In all of our studies of history, we've gone back. I mean, we spent a lot of time looking at this at the outset. And our general view is that if you don't know, the president can declare a tariff, and the base of time is for 5 months. That is not enough time for anyone to ever reroute a supply chain, to change how they approach the fundamentals of how they're going to sell things. So if they want to take the opportunity to do it, they can. But if it's just to make a temporary price hike, that doesn't change the economic reality of whatever business that you're in. And so when we look at it, we would say there's always an action, there's always those effects, but there tends to be, in our view, an overreaction to these kinds of temporary moves. And especially when we don't have enough experience as a country in implementing a tariff to know what the full impact is going to be. I think 5 months is actually a really good amount of time to see how it affects earnings, to see how it affects inflation, whether that good causes a substitution effect and there's no price increase, at which point it's not inflationary, or maybe it is in a way that we didn't understand. But to have that baseline of give it a few months, let it go through an earning cycle is something that for whatever reason, the market has not wanted to kind of give it credit. And so what we've done is we've projected a lot of fear and uncertainty in the market. And so when you look, there are a lot of companies that are trading at much lower prices that have not had a meaningful move in their earnings power. Go back to my first thing. I look at the world through the world of earnings and then economic news. And we see a lot of noise. We see a little bit of economic movement. And then we see very little in the way of people adjusting what they think they're going to make as a company. And so when we look at that, we would say on balance, where we are is that tariffs are kind of an unknown for the U.S. It's something we haven't done a lot since the 1930s. It's President Trump's one of his preferred tools, but the fear of them is very analogous to, if you remember, probably about 10 years ago, there was this thing called Brexit. And if you remember, people were terrified of what was going to happen when the UK broke some of its trade treaties. And it wasn't tariffs exactly, but it was adding some restrictions on trading in the UK. And the investment community was apocalyptic about it in a way that in the end, when we look back, now there might have been some damage from doing some of it. Obviously, adding trade barriers inhibits free trade. But I think what can happen is we overestimate the magnitude of the effect and we underestimate the resilience of American, or in that case, British companies to kind of reroute if they need to. And so I think I'm hopeful that at the end of the day with this, that it's going to be much ado about nothing. The last point I'll make is that when you look at the comprehensive list of kind of Trump's plans, there's also this tax plan. I think recognizing that a tariff is a regressive tax, the idea of getting rid of the first, taxes on the first $150,000 of income would be kind of the offsetting part of it. And we'll see if he gets that through, if that becomes kind of the law of the land. But my guess is if you put those two things together, that would be net beneficiary for kind of lower end consumers, even though they would pay more for some goods at the margin. That having that no income tax would be net stimulative. But we just have to see. It's too early to tell if that idea actually gets through Congress, if that becomes the law of the land. And so I think what we find ourselves is very much like Brexit 10 years ago. We're speculating on very little information. And so what I'm going to follow is what's actually happening in earnings and what's actually happening with the companies that are making the decisions in that context, because I tend to think they tend to be much more resilient than anybody that's in Washington, D.C. on a daily basis.